Hi, this is Sue Jackson from the Book by Book blog, and I'm here today with my 2024 reading wrap-up. I'm going to start with some stats from last year, tell you what my reading year looked like, and then my best of picks in different categories. And finally, I'm just going to quickly run through my top 10 novels of the year. So let's start with an overview. I read 73 books last year. That was just a few less than the year before, but I don't set a numerical goal. The number is what it is. I read a lot of very big books last year, so that's why I don't worry about numerical goals. So it was a few less than the year before, but that's fine. Of those 73, 61 were fiction. That's 84%. That leaves only 12 nonfiction, 16%. But that is pretty typical for me. I don't read nearly as much nonfiction as I do novels. So to break that 73 books down a little bit further, 44 were adult fiction, clearly my biggest category. 8 were adult nonfiction. I read 8 books last year for teens or YA, and 12 books for middle grade. Of my 73 books total, 33 were on audio. That's 45%. So you can see I'm enjoying almost half of my books on audio, which I love. It's a great way to enjoy more books, but also some books are just extra spectacular on audio. And I'll talk about that in a moment. 5 of my books last year were graphic novels or memoirs. Actually, I think most were graphic memoirs. I read no short story collections for the 3rd year in a row. I should really get back into that because I do enjoy short stories. I normally shoot for 6 classics, and I only read 4 last year, so fell a little short of my goal there. But I did read 1 book of poetry, which broke my 5-year streak of 0 poetry. I discovered Mary Oliver last year and really loved the book of her poetry that I read. So thank you to my friends, the Book Cougars. They've got a great reading podcast for introducing me to Mary Oliver. I hope to read more of her in the new year. So a few other ways to look at my reading. Of those 73 books, 45 or 62% were by women authors. That's about the same as last year. 41 of my books, or 56%, were diverse books. That was a little higher than last year. And 31 books, or 42%, were from my own shelves. I would love for that to be higher. There were quite a few books I read for Booktopia, which are by definition new releases. There were quite a few books I read for my book group, which I usually get out of the library. So taking those into consideration, I mean, I'm losing the battle with my TBR bookcase. It's got a full double row now, and I just got more books for Christmas, but this is a good sign that I am making progress. I had 0 rereads last year, and there were also no authors that I read more than once in the whole year. So that was interesting. My shortest book was the Mary Oliver book of poetry, 1,000 Mornings by Mary Oliver, which was 88 pages. My longest book was Drums of Autumn by Diana Gabaldon, which was 880 pages, a nice symmetry there. My average book length was 340 pages. These stats are thanks to Goodreads. I don't track the number of pages I read, but apparently they do, which is about what it was the year before. It was 344 average book length the year before. The total pages that I read according to Goodreads was 24,871, which again is very close to the year before. Okay, so let's dive into my picks for best book of the year in multiple categories. First, my best novel of the year. Well, that had to be Lonesome Dove. I read a lot of great novels last year. I had a really hard time narrowing my favorites down to just my top 10. But this one has to come out on top because, and this is kind of my criteria for a really good novel, this book made me laugh out loud often. It also made me sob my eyes out. That to me is the sign of a really good book. And it was completely immersive. I read it for Big Book Summer, my own challenge that I host every year, but also for June on the Range. It took me the whole month of June to read it, but it was worth it. Just an outstanding book. I can see why it won the Pulitzer. My best nonfiction was Leave Only Footprints, My Acadia to Zion Journey Through Every National Park by Conor Knighton. I talked about this one during my nonfiction November. We love to travel, we love national parks, we love the outdoors. This book was just fabulous. Conor is on CBS Sunday morning. And I now that I've read the book and feel like I know him, I enjoy seeing his segments on that show. He started this as a project for himself, but he also did segments for the show. And you can tell he is a storyteller, and he finds some really fascinating element in each of the national parks to talk about. Most of the nonfiction I read last year was memoir. It is my favorite kind of nonfiction. My favorite, though, was an easy pick, Tell Me More by Kelly Corrigan. The subtitle is Stories About the 12 Hardest Things I'm Learning to Say. And as with Lonesome Dove, very different kind of book, but this made me both tear up and laugh out loud. I haven't finished, I'm still trying to catch up on my quotes journal from last year, but you can see I've tabbed so many pages. I could relate so well to what Kelly writes about here, about the loss of her father, which I went through 10 years ago as well, about being a wife and a mother and a friend. It's just a wonderful book. I always enjoy listening to Kelly when I hear her on podcasts, and I really enjoy her own podcast, which the name of it is escaping me, so I'll put that up here. Loved reading this. My pick for top audiobook that I listened to last year was The Women by Kristen Hanna. All of my picks for top audiobooks last year were books where the audio production itself added an extra element, made it extra special. And this was definitely true of The Women. It was so completely immersive on audio. You just felt like you were a part of that world. You were there with the main character. And I've seen this book on a lot of people's best of lists, and it deserves its place there. Just an outstanding book. It is also on my list of top 10 novels of the year. My best YA novel of the year was one that I didn't realize was YA when I started it. Yes, there's a sticker right on front. Firekeeper's Daughter by Angeline Boulley. I'm a little late to the party on this one, but I am so glad I finally read it. Just outstanding. I can see why it got so much hype. It deserved it. Fabulous book. Besides not realizing it was YA, I also didn't realize that it was mystery, suspense, thriller. So it is about a young woman who is half indigenous, half white, living in a community with a large indigenous population, and so she kind of feels torn between two worlds. She ends up helping with a case to find out who is dealing drugs in their community and where the drugs are coming from. Outstanding book on so many counts. Speaking of counts, my favorite middle grade book last year was Countdown by Deborah Wiles. This is another one I listened to on audio, and the audio is part of what made it so special. Although I also got this book out of the library so that I could see the print edition. It is part of her 60s trilogy, and these are just amazing books. It's historical fiction set in the 60s. This is the first one in the trilogy. I think it's set in 1962 during the Cuban Missile Crisis. And because it is a middle grade novel, it focuses on the perspective of an 11-year-old girl during that time. The nuclear bomb drills that they had to do in school, what it was like to be a kid during that time. Excellent book, and excellent on audio as well as in print, because she integrates all kinds of real life historical information into the books. So on audio, it was radio broadcasts and advertisements and the president's State of the Nation address. And in the book, it's similar, only in print. Really outstanding, the whole series is, but I enjoyed Countdown. The best graphic novel / book that I read all year was Sunshine, How One Camp Taught Me About Life, Death, and Hope by Jarrett Krasoska. He is a favorite author of mine. He also wrote this is a graphic memoir, and he also wrote the graphic memoir, Hey Kiddo. Both are focused on a YA audience, but both are outstanding for adults as well. This is about his experience, his senior year of high school, working at a camp for very sick kids, and how that literally changed his life. And you can see I've still got some quotes tabbed in here that I want to write down as well. And finally, like I said, I didn't quite meet my classics goal of the year of 6, but I did read 4 classics, and of those, this was my favorite, As They Were by MFK Fisher, my first book by her, and I really enjoyed it. I know she's known for food writing, and there was a lot of that in here, but it's also a very personal memoir. It's about travel. There were lots of scenes in France that I really enjoyed, and also about aging and childhood even. She starts with her childhood and goes all the way through to the end of her life here. So I really enjoyed that. Finally, I'm just going to go very quickly through my top 10 novels of the year. And as I said, this was a difficult choice. I read so many books last year that I gave 5 stars to. Books that really moved me, books that I was completely engrossed in. But I did manage to narrow it down to my top 10. Now, I couldn't put them in order. That's just asking too much of me. So instead, these are in alphabetical order. So my top 10 were Cloud Cuckoo Land by Anthony Doerr. I read this, and you will hear this a lot. I read this for my own Big Book Summer Challenge. It was a finalist for the National Book Award. I've been meaning to read it for years, and I am so glad I finally did. The whole book is enjoyable. It's one of those books that takes different narrative threads from different time periods and different places, but weaves them all together. And I enjoyed the whole book. I enjoyed each of the narrators in different times, but I really loved like the last quarter or third of the book where all the pieces come together. I love a novel about connections. Drums of Autumn by Diana Gabaldon. She is becoming an annual presence on my best of list because her last 2 books I mean, I loved Outlander and Dragonfly and Amber, but her last two books, Voyager, which I read last year, and Drums of Autumn, which I read this year for Big Book Summer, just blew me away. Now, it may have helped that I was sick with COVID while I was reading this. So I read it in record time, 3 weeks instead of the usual month that a chunkster like this will take me. But also I was just so completely immersed in the story. The other thing I particularly liked about this one is that it is set in Western North Carolina, in the Smokies, what we call the Smokies now, an area that I'm very familiar with and that I love. So that really helped as well. Another book on my top 10 novels of the year list that I read for Big Book Summer. Are you seeing a trend here? The Ferryman by Justin Cronin. I'm a longtime fan of Cronin. I enjoyed the Passage trilogy. I really loved The Summer Guest, which is a completely different kind of novel from him, kind of a quiet story set in northern Maine about family and connections. This was completely different again, and I just loved it. The Ferryman, it's science fiction, but what brought it to the top 10 list is that, like a lot of science fiction, it has a component that is very thought-provoking, that calls back to our own world today and what is happening in our world, and that makes you think. But it's also a highly entertaining novel, so it has it all. Homegoing by Yaa Gyasi. When I read this in February, I thought it would be my #1 book of the year, so let's call it #2. Absolutely outstanding novel. Covers 8 generations, starting with 2 half-sisters in Ghana in the 1700s. One is sold into slavery and shipped to the United States. The other stays in Ghana. And then we follow this family, both threads of it, through 8 generations. And I worried that there wouldn't be enough of each generation. It's not a huge book, but it was perfect. It was very well written. It was completely engrossing. And yeah, that was one of my top reads of the year. Now, Yaa Gyasi was a brand new author for me. Victor Lodato is a beloved author. I first met him at Booktopia, where he was there for his book Edgar and Lucy, which is also outstanding. This is his latest book. It was released in April, and he had sent me an advance reader copy and a wonderful note. He is just such a good writer. And like Edgar and Lucy, this book was so good. It has everything. It's got humor. It's about a woman in her 80s who's looking back on her life, and she has moved back to New Jersey after living most of her adult life in California and is kind of trying to come to terms with her life. It's a story about secrets. It's a story about connection. It's funny, it's moving. I really loved it. And I didn't hear a whole lot about it this year, which disappointed me because this book deserves a lot of love, so I hope you'll check it out. The House in the Cerulean Sea by T.J. Klune. Again, I'm late to the game on this one. Everyone else already knew about this book. I did read both this and the follow-up that was new this year, Somewhere Beyond the Sea. Both belong on this list, but I only chose one just to be fair to the other books. This is one that is also on my list of best audiobooks of the year because the audio is fabulous. If you have read this book and you're a fan of it, I highly suggest you check out the audio. I was certain it was a full cast audio because each of the children has a completely unique voice. It's one single, very talented narrator. So I finally found out what everybody else has been saying about this book. but I especially loved the audio. This is alphabetical, not in order, so obviously Lonesome Dove by Larry McMurtry is in the mix for my top 10 novels. And these next two were the last two books I read this year, or close to the last. So this is why I don't make my best of lists in December, because there are still some great books. First, The Mighty Red by Louise Erdrich. She is one of my favorite authors, and I love her books on audio. Now, she didn't narrate this one herself, but the narration was still excellent. This is a book about a community. It includes some tragedy, but also joy, about coming together to overcome tragedy. It's a wonderful, wonderful novel. As always, Erdrich's characters are just so rich and three-dimensional. I loved spending time with them. A Visit from the Goon Squad by Jennifer Egan was, again, one of my last books of the year. This won the Pulitzer, and I finally got to find out why. I loved this book. As I said earlier, I love books about connections. That is what this is all about. It uses an unusual form with different chapters by different characters, including some secondary or minor characters, but it all comes together. And I loved seeing those connections, how one person's life can create ripples that affect hundreds of other people. It was just as good as I had heard, and I can't wait to read the sequel to this. And finally, The Women by Kristen Hanna. As I said, it was my #1 audio of the year, and it also makes my top 10 list for novels. Just an outstanding book. So I would love to hear what you loved reading last year. Please let me know in the comments below. What were your favorite novels of the year?